What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the finale of Dear Esther. In the last episode, I was just shy of getting to the real meat of the game, the story of it. But, of course, I have one more little aside to get out of the way. So, I ended last episode by saying that I wasn't necessarily defending Dear Esther before. I was just trying to justify why elements of it can work. I do agree that it's kind of a boring game. What I will defend it on, though, is that the minimalism? I'm not even gonna try to go ahead with that thought. The minimalist gameplay gives way to this really, really spectacular sightseeing tour. And I don't want every game to be like that, but there's definitely room for it. And I love just being able to be kind of a tourist, a sightseer here, because they craft such an awesome looking, beautiful world full of vivid detail.
I sat here and watched two jets carve parallel white lines into the sky. They charted their course, and I followed them for 21 minutes until they turned off near Sanford and were lost. If I were a gull, I would abandon my nest and join them. I would starve my brain of oxygen and suffer delusions of transcendence. I would tear the bottom from my boat and sail across the motorways until I reached this island once again.
And sometimes it's nice to just be able to escape to some beautiful, detailed world and be absorbed by the environment. Again, to be a video game virtual tourist, however you want to describe that. That's part of the value of these walking tour games, is that they're very calm and meditative, and if they're done right, if the environments are done right, they're meditative and they are stress-free escapism.
We shall begin to assemble our own version of the North Shore. We will scrawl in dead languages and electrical diagrams and hide them away for future theologians to muse and mumble over. We will send a letter to Esther Donnelly and demand her answer. We will mix the paint with ashes and tarmac and the glow from our infections. We will paint a moon over the Sanford Junction and blue lights falling like stars along the hard shoulder.
I find it really interesting that he actually mentioned Esther's last name, Donnelly, which I'll get into in just a moment. But wrapping up that thought that I was going on a tangent about, I credit the environments a lot for Skyrim being the first Elder Scrolls game that I've truly loved. There's way more to it than just the environments being detailed, but I didn't get that with Morrowind, I didn't get that with Oblivion, I never played Arena or Daggerfall, but Skyrim has such an intricate, detailed, lived-in world, and I could have spent hours in it just exploring, and I did just that. I mean, it helps that it had much better game feel than Oblivion, but I don't know, I think the detail in the environments is what really helped cement that experience as being one that I wanted to participate in. So, now as for the story, I haven't been addressing the narrator this whole time, or what he's been saying, because one, the individual pieces of his narration are, they're mostly pretty clear in what he's saying. The thing is, the narrator can be a little bit unreliable, but the content of his words, there's not a ton to comment on. At least I don't think. And also because they're randomized. They're telling, like, fractured parts of a whole story, so I might as well talk about what he isn't saying that could have been said, or how it all connects together into this bigger picture about the characters. I've mostly been talking around the narrator, because I still like the prose and there's still some importance to what he's saying, so I don't want to just talk over him. I just question how important all the narrated plot elements are compared to the overall themes.
There were chemical stains on the tarmac, the leak of air conditioning, brake fluid and petrol. He kept sniffing at his fingers as he sat by the roadside, waiting as if he couldn't quite understand or recognize their smell. He said he'd been travelling back from a sales conference in Exeter. He'd stopped for farewell drinks earlier, but had kept a careful eye on his intake. You could hear the sirens above the idling traffic.
That, and I think the meat of the game, the most interesting stuff, isn't necessarily what is being spoken, but the context that the narrator provides to the overarching narrative, the thematic elements, all of that stuff.
From here, I can see my armada. I collected all the letters I'd ever meant to send to you, if I'd have ever made it to the mainland, but had instead collected at the bottom of my rucksack, and I spread them out along the lost beach. Then I took each and every one, and I folded them into boats. I folded you into the creases, and then, as the sun was setting, I set the fleet to sail. Shattered into 21 pieces, I consigned you to the Atlantic, and I sat here until I'd watched all of you sink.
Real quick, I just want to point out that the narrator is voiced by Nigel Carrington, who really deserves to be a bigger name in voice acting than he is, given the quality of his work here. Even if you don't like the game, you've got to admit that Carrington is talented, seriously talented. I don't know about his range because he isn't a big, prolific voice actor like, say, Nolan North or Liam O'Brien or Steve Blum. But after Dear Esther, I think it's safe to say that he deserves more voiceover work. If he isn't already getting a lot of offers, he might just be turning a lot of stuff down. He's got a voice that I could listen to forever, much like a Morgan Freeman. So, as for the game itself, finally, the game takes place on an unnamed Hebridean island. The Hebrides, by the way, are islands off the coast of, I think, Scotland.
The pain in my leg sent me blind for a few minutes as I struggled up the cliff path. I swallowed another handful of painkillers, and now I feel almost lucid. The island around me has retreated to a hazed distance, whilst the moon appears to have descended into my palm to guide me. I can see a thick black line of infection reaching for my heart from the waistband of my trousers. Through the fugue, it's all the world like the path I have cut from the lowlands towards the aerial.
So, the plot of Dear Esther, the basic plot of it, follows a series of characters, and I'm going to try to break each of them down. So we start off with the narrator, and it's not terribly clear who he is, and he himself is not very reliable. There's a lot of theories about who he is. I've heard everything from it could be Esther to it could be just some random person who's reading left behind memoirs.
I've begun my voyage in a paper boat without a bottom. I will fly to the moon in it. I've been folded along a crease in time, a weakness in the sheet of life. Now you've settled on the opposite side of the paper to me. I can see your traces in the ink that soaks through the fiber, the pulped vegetation. When we become waterlogged and the cage disintegrates, we will intermingle. When this paper aeroplane leaves the cliff edge and casts parallel vapor trails in the dark, we will come together.
But the most plausible theory is that he's simply Esther's husband, and that's the assumption that I'm going to go with for the rest of this. So, it follows our narrator, and he's talking about this overarching story involving Esther, Paul, Donnelly, and Jacobson. As best I can tell, this is how things break down. So a car accident occurs and the narrator loses Esther, his wife, and it's why he talks about driving up and down a stretch of highway over and over again.
If only Donnelly had experienced this, he would have realized he was his own shoreline, as am I. Just as I am becoming this island, so he became his syphilis, retreating into the burning synapses, the stones, the infection.
It's him attempting to understand and cope with the loss of his wife. So the car in the crash that killed Esther was being driven by Paul, who may or may not have been drunk. It's not terribly clear. The narrator kind of wavers back and forth between suggesting Esther was killed by a drunk driver, and then he eventually goes off about, no, he actually wasn't drunk, and I just interpret that as the narrator trying to make sense of the world.
The stones in my stomach will weigh me down and ensure my descent is true and straight. I will break through the fog of these godforsaken pills and achieve clarity. All my functions are clogged, all my veins are choked. If my leg doesn't rot off before I reach the summit, it will be a miracle. There are 21 connections in the circuit diagram of the anti-lock brakes. There are 21 species of gull inhabiting these islands. It is 21 miles between the Sandford Junction and the turn-off for home. All these things cannot, will not be a coincidence.
Also, as an aside about Paul, he is apparently like an antacid yogurt salesman in Europe, or something to that extent. He also gives the narrator a mug with a bunch of chemical diagrams scrawled all over it, which is where you get that recurring motif from. Also, I read on the wiki that some of the diagrams painted on the walls might allude to the possibility of a brake failure leading to the car crash. And some of the chemical diagrams relate to Donnelly's syphilis in some way or another. And there's another in a cave we already passed, which depicted an unstable nitrogen group, and I believe there was also the chemical diagram for dopamine scrawled somewhere. Okay, so as for Donnelly, he wrote a book on the island that the narrator refers to constantly, and he also had syphilis and a drug addiction.
A gull perched on a spent bonnet, sideways, whilst the sirens fell through the middle distance and the metal moaned in grief about us. I'm about this night in walking, old bread and gull bones, old Donnelly at the bar gripping his drink, old Esther walking with our children, old Paul as ever, old Paul. He shakes and he shivers and he turns off his lights alone.
Jacobson was an 18th century shepherd who lived on the island, and Donnelly apparently knew him, or knew of him at least. And I honestly don't know what role he plays in the story beyond existing ones. I actually think he's there to show how much conflicting information there is, since what we know of Jacobson comes from Donnelly, who gives the narrator multiple accounts of his death, each conflicting. We can't really take anything as being reliable, which is why I think the plot is... it's important, but in a way that might be overlooked. It's not the straight sequence of A to B events that's important. It's more showing how confounding everything is. I think it's confusing to make a point.
I have run out of places to climb. I will abandon this body and take to the air.
Dear Esther, I have burned the cliffs of Damascus. I have drunk deep of it. My heart is my leg, and a black line etched on the paper all along this boat without a bottom. You are all the world like a nest to me. Eggs unbroken form like fossils, come together, send small black flowers to the air. From this infection, hope. From this island, flight. From this grief, love.
So the creators of the original mod and the remake made this section with zero interaction because they didn't want players getting distracted or dicking around, and the other reason that the ending is scripted, further limiting the already extremely limited interaction you have with the game, well, removing the interaction, let's be honest, was because the game was originally a source mod, which if you've ever played a source game, their ladders are garbage. And the climb is a long one. If you fall off, you pretty much get to do the whole thing over, and they didn't want the player ruining their experience by falling off. And that is why I call the game pretentious, for that reason alone. I'm sure there are many other arguments you could make about this game's pretensions, but that is a little hard to swallow for me. So this is the way the game ends. Let's talk about theories a little bit. There's one theory that posits that because we can't take any account of any of the characters, including the narrator, as reliable, it's possible that the entire island is a hallucination, and everything in the game is compacted into the island as a symbol of the events of the narrator's life, crammed into one short flash, a final burst of neurons firing before death. Which is similar to the way I read into Limbo. There's also the island as Limbo theory. And the other thing that I think is interesting about that theory, the idea that there is a parallel between the narrator driving up and down the same stretch of highway and the possibility of him having been dead the whole time and wandering the island trying to find closure, and then finally repeating his final suicidal leap for closure. Another way of interpreting it is that all of these characters being referred to are sides of his psyche, or outright dissociations, multiple personalities. This especially, I think, makes sense, as Paul is clearly a reference to the biblical Paul, and the narrator's journey mirrors and references Paul on the road to Damascus several times, and Damascus also tends to come up a lot in the script. And just to recap that story, if you're not familiar, Paul went to Damascus to arrest Jesus and was struck blind for, I think, 3 days, and a revelation from heaven revealed to him that Christ was, in fact, the Son of God. And after he arrived in Damascus, I believe he was cured, and he converted into a believer and became Paul the Apostle. And the narrator goes on a similarly transformative journey, but the nature of that transformation is, well, suicide and coping. And maybe the biblical passages feel a little heavy-handed in this game because they were late additions to the script, where Paul was established and the writer just felt that relating it to the biblical Paul story synced well with the themes of Dear Esther. I'm not sure. It feels a little out of place, but that's the deal with that. So, as best I can read into this, I really like the way ambiguity is used in this game, because it's not just artifice for the sake of artifice. It's not a big J.J. Abrams or Stephen Moffat mystery box style story with no payoff, and that leaves more questions than answers. It genuinely leads interesting places, even though it's entirely open-ended. And as best I can tell, it's meant to unsettle. Like, that's its purpose built to do that. And it's also kind of meant to confound you. The chemical symbols, the circuits, and passages appearing on the wall, the narrator meandering through his thoughts, the unreliable accounts, the apparitions, the dead ends that require lengthy backtracking your first time through that you're likely to hit, they exist to inspire confusion. The chemical symbols and the diagrams, all that stuff is esoteric for the purpose of confusing an audience who's not likely to be familiar with that stuff, at least as far as I can tell. And plus, there's also the fact that the narration is randomized. It takes emphasis off the idea of a focused, coherent story, and it makes it seem like the game is deliberately trying to be devoid of meaning. And maybe I'm wording myself poorly with that. It's not that there aren't underlying themes or a larger story arc. There is, but they seem almost secondary, like less important by design. And I do get something really resonant out of it, though. I'm just making a case that the game is less about Paul and Esther and Donnelly and all them, less about the obvious symbolism and more about why it is we analyze these things. It's a forest for the trees kind of situation. So what I think that's all leading up to, what I think the big build-up is for, is to kind of indicate that the game is about grief and coping. It's about the chaos and confusion that results from loss. It's about knowing what it's like to lose someone. In the narrator's case, it was Esther, and the search for answers that follows. And it's an aimless search. There usually aren't very many answers, at least none that are going to satisfy you in a situation of extreme loss, because sometimes it's just random. Like, the universe sometimes just deals us bad hands, and it's difficult to accept that. It confounds us, Dear Esther does, because we seek rationality in situations that defy it. The narrator loses Esther and embarks on a quest of discovery to try to figure out why. Death, disease, loss, they're all closely linked here. But that's why it's all so confounding. It's supposed to be. The essence of subtext in narrative is in the player's ability to divine meaning, and the game confounds that search for meaning and might not actually provide any real closure, and in that way it mirrors life. We force reasons upon situations because the revelation that there might not be a solution is really genuinely frightening. It's about seeking closure and grieving and coping with grief. It's about a desperate search for logic in a completely illogical situation. And the way the player character, the narrator, ultimately chooses to cope is to commit suicide and embrace the freedom from his grief that he finds in death. And that freedom is represented by him casting a seagull shadow, which he talked about at the very beginning of this episode, and taking flight, an ability often, associated with freedom. And yeah, that's pretty much the bulk of what I have to say about Dear Esther. It is a boring experience. It is very minimalist. It's not boring as the result of just being minimalist. There are other things that work. I do think that the ways you can read into it are profoundly interesting, and that's why I think the game does deserve a lot of the credit it gets. It might be a little bit overrated, but like I said, it's nothing if not interesting in at least a few ways. I feel like I'm caveating that a lot. That is how I read into it. I'm very curious to see what your guys' reaction... Your guys'? Whatever. What your reactions are, if this is the first time that you have seen or experienced Dear Esther, or if you played it before and really had time to noodle over it and come to your own interpretations. But that's going to do it for my side of this discussion. Hopefully it carries on in the comments for a while. Some people definitely posted some really interesting readings of Limbo, so I'm curious to see how you guys read into Dear Esther. So if you like this video, be sure to check out my channel and the playlists on it for plenty more content. I'm uploading a video every single day. There's the more loud and boisterous stuff that I do with Mike. You can check videos like the Asura's Wrath playthrough out, Shadows of the Damned, Banjo-Kazooie, Alan Wake, stuff like that. Or if you want some more subdued, informative style commentary, I usually save that for the solo playthroughs. I'm doing Demon Souls right now. Of course, there's Limbo, there's Bayonetta, which is probably one of my favorite Let's Plays that I've done so far. Mega Man X, all sorts of fun stuff. Also, feel free to hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, do all that fun stuff. And yeah, keep the conversation going in the comments. That about wraps up my ending spiel, which might actually be longer than the entire rest of this episode combined. So, before this gets any longer, thanks for watching, guys. Take it easy. Have a good one.